Hello and welcome to the third edition of WION World Order. I'm your host Palki Sharma Upadhyay, and today we're going to discuss the geopolitical significance of the Indo-Pacific and ASEAN view. If ASEAN were a country, it would be among the top 10 economies of the world. With more than 620 million people, it is home to more people than North America or the EU. It was set up in 1967 by 5 countries. Today it has 10 members. What is the geopolitical significance of this grouping and what is its future? To discuss that, we have with us a very special panel, our dialogue partners. Let me introduce you to them. Ambassador Siddhartho Reza Suryodipuro, Ambassador of the Republic of Indonesia to India. We have Gurjeet Singh, former Indian Ambassador to ASEAN. We have Chutinthorn Gongsadki, Ambassador of Thailand to India, and Pham San Chao, Ambassador of Vietnam to India. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to WION. Ambassador, let me begin with you. What is the collective vision of the Indo-Pacific?
Collective vision of Indo-Pacific. I think that recently ASEAN came up with a collective paper which called the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And in that paper, we have been able to describe in full all the how we believe in the future of Indo-Pacific, the objective, the principles, and most importantly, some content of how we see in the Indo-Pacific. And I want to stress that if you look at the Indo-Pacific from ASEAN perspective, you see this is horizontal and vertical. Vertical, we try to connect all the regions in the Indo-Pacific. We call Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean. And vertical, we try to address the questions from security to connectivity to economic cooperation and also to a sustainable development objective. So which is a very comprehensive document, and it stresses on the importance of taking ASEAN centrality to make sure that ASEAN can play a central role in this architecture, and to make sure that ASEAN can lead the process, and also to make sure that the evolving security structure will not overlap the current one that ASEAN have put in place for the past several decades, such as East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Plus, ADMM Plus, things like that. So basically, this is the first time we come up with a collective concept of how we see the future of the Indo-Pacific region.
Ambassador, Indonesia has often spoken about an ASEAN-style Indo-Pacific. What does that entail?
It's a concept of Indo-Pacific that ASEAN had developed. It's called the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Various countries would have their own version of Indo-Pacific. But from the ASEAN concept, first of all, we develop our own concept. This is a concept that would take into account developments in the Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, and how the connections are made. A lot of more countries go to the oceans for their security, their prosperity. Human activities go on the surface of the ocean, body of ocean, on the seabed. So all of these are happening. How do we integrate all of them into one outlook? And secondly, we have a platform. It's called the East Asia Summit. This is an annual meeting of leaders, of 16 leaders. So countries that have their own conception, could be the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, it could be the Indian Sagar, it could be the US Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and all others. All of them are part of the East Asia Summit. So the ASEAN concept is to bring everybody to the same table and to discuss Indo-Pacific and how to make it beneficial to all from the security perspective, stability, as well as the prosperity, and as my friend Ambassador of Vietnam talked about, connectivity. How do we have greater connectivity in Southeast Asia and among all the members. So this is the ASEAN way of creating a positive ecosystem for everybody.
Right. You've spoken about so many groupings, so many platforms. ASEAN was created 50 years ago. Is it still relevant today?
Oh, very much so.
How so?
Because you have invited us as ASEAN, to come and talk about the Indo-Pacific, right? We are the 10 and soon to be 11 nations, part of Southeast Asia. We are at the center of the geographical space that you're talking about. And so we are very much relevant. And, but we are small. Together, we have some more negotiating power, but we are small compared to the regional players in the region, right? So the Indo-Pacific is our response to how, we can maintain geographical balance in the region, how we can engage all these players in a constructive manner. Because in the end, what we want, and I'm sure all the others want as well, is economic development, prosperity, inclusiveness, and stability and peace. So ASEAN would like to, as my colleagues say, provide a platform where everyone can sit at the table. We are hoping that the East Asia Summit that comes up, the leaders can speak in an informal way, in an open way, as we are doing now, about the situation in the region and how everyone can engage each other.
The ASEAN Outlook after the 34th summit spoke about or had repeated references to the centrality of ASEAN countries. Many experts believe that this betrays a fear that ASEAN may be sliding into irrelevance given the broader and bigger regional confrontation.
The ASEAN Outlook is a wonderful document in very true ASEAN style. It says all the good things, and it's like a model document. People should study it. It brings together the SDGs, connectivity, maritime security, and everybody's interest, right? But like all good documents, it doesn't come up with the problem which instigated this document. So it's like freedom. You never really feel free till your freedom is threatened. So why does the Indo-Pacific important today? Because the conceptions which back the values of Indo-Pacific are under threat to some way or the other. So there was a retreat of the Americans over some years, leaving a kind of a power vacuum where the central role of ASEAN was perhaps in a vacuum now. And other powers were trying to come in. There was the concept of Asia-Pacific. So one transition from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific is the clear inclusion of India in this conception. Now, Indo doesn't refer to India, it refers to the Indian Ocean. But by putting the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean together, basically you brought India into play as an emerging power. So today what you have is ASEAN 10, and you have the Quad, which is the informal grouping, which makes 14. The only two countries out of the EAS 16, leaving aside the superpowers, the USA and Russia, are China and Korea. Korea for its own reason. Now, China is not among either the Quad or the ASEAN 10, and I think that is the unwritten story. Whether you read Prime Minister Modi's Shangri-La dialogue speech or you read the Outlook, the unwritten story is the changes in this region which China has instigated through aggressive behavior. And that, I think, brings the question, what is it? Where India is concerned, our Shangri-La dialogue speech of Prime Minister Modi and the India-ASEAN commemorative summit clearly say that ASEAN remains central to us. And that this centrality is not only geographical centrality to the region, but is central to our thinking. And I think ASEAN in its own way follows the middle path of the Buddha, which also we would like everybody to follow. So I think this is how I see it, that there is a good approach to ASEAN centrality, but there are threats to the values and the area that we live in. That is why we constantly talk about open and open sea lanes. Why do we talk about open sea lanes? Why didn't we talk about 50 years ago? Because the threat was not there. Why do we talk about certain value systems? Because we feel threatened. And I think some countries do not have a direct threat. Some countries do. And I think this is where the basics of ASEAN centrality come in. And they are very good at marshalling diversity of opinion, thought, and every other way, and creating a system where everybody, without criticizing anybody directly, still gets their point of view across.
Since you've spoken about the threat, now the question is, how do you deal with that threat? How do you respond to it? How can ASEAN take the lead in shaping this regional strategic narrative?
Well, I also would like to add to what has been said by my colleague, Ambassador of Thailand, that why ASEAN is so relevant nowadays, because until now, ASEAN is still the most successful regional grouping in the world. No single grouping in the world capable of bringing to a table all the major powers to discuss security-related matters. So only ASEAN can create that platform, can lead that platform. And this is the region where ASEAN is located centrally. So this is very relevant for ASEAN to assume that role. Now you talk about the challenges for that and the threat. I agree with what has been said by Ambassador Singh that yes, we see challenges as we term it. As currently Vietnam is facing challenges because Chinese is deploying its seismic survey vessels within the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam and within its continental shelf. And we try to call them to pull out of this economic zone over the past several days, but they haven't done that. So truly, it is a violation of Vietnam's sovereignty and sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the waters as provided for by the international law, including the international law on the sea. So the threat is there. So how we have to address that threat? So this is one of the threats that the ambassador just mentioned. And how do we have to address that? We believe that we have to address that collectively with ASEAN and with the whole Indo-Pacific. We have to make our partner understand that they have to respect the law, and we are building Indo-Pacific on the basis of rule-based order. So, and respect for international law, respect for national sovereignty is the fundamental principles. So why we have to talk about Indo-Pacific now more constantly, more with a higher intensity? Because there is challenges coming from various corners. So I think that, but for us, we will definitely to address that challenge very much in line with the law. Namely, we will do all the legal manners and peaceful manners, because we are for settlement, peaceful settlement of disputes and renunciation to threat or use of force. And we also can use judicial process in order to address the disputes. Like the Court on the Law of the Sea just passed a ruling 3 years ago on the cases brought to the court by the Philippines. So we continue to challenge the challenge, we continue to face the challenge, but we do address that in a peaceful way and in accordance with international law.
That is the ideal situation, but we've seen the increased militarization of the South China Sea and this region, and there is talk of a new code of conduct for negotiation. And yet, do you believe that ASEAN is then dealing with this challenge as one bloc, as one force, because various countries also have their own bilateral engagements with the Chinese and others? So how do you balance that as a bloc?
Well, we look at diplomacy as layers of activities. Obviously, you will have bilateral diplomacy, you will have multilateral UN-style diplomacy, you have regional like ASEAN. So look at it as layers of activities. The code of conduct is ASEAN's way of, in our discussions with China, to ensure that a certain code is honored in the use of the South China Sea. This is an ongoing process. All ASEAN members are in it. It is not a process leading to determination of ownership of any of the features, but it is about code of conduct. Now, when we talk about these layers, first from the Indonesian perspective, we are not a claimant state. We have no claim on the South China Sea. A number of other ASEAN countries may not have claim as well, but all of us are in it together. Now, let me also just point out, the Ambassador of Vietnam talked about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Basically, we are talking about freedom of navigation, of overflight. This is what everybody has to respect, and everybody is respecting now, this freedom of navigation. Any threat to freedom of navigation may not only happen in Southeast Asian waters, but may happen elsewhere that would impact on Southeast Asian waters. Recent developments in Gibraltar and the Straits of Hormuz, these are straits used for international navigation, just like straits in Southeast Asian waters are straits used for international navigation. So we have to be vigilant, first and foremost in our region, but also we have to be vigilant about developments elsewhere. But one point to underline is that Southeast Asian waters is among the most strategic waters in the world. That's why when we talk about ASEAN centrality, we talk about the centrality of the ASEAN, all the platforms it builds. But it also talks basically, maybe inadvertently, talking about this geographical centrality of Southeast Asia as well. So look at the Code of Conduct within these broad context as well. And we hope that the Code of Conduct could, pretty soon we'll have a single text, and it would be agreed upon very soon.
Right, we'll wait and see. How do you think ASEAN can ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific in the face of this aggression? And there are fears that given the reservations or the exigencies that each member state faces, the Code of Conduct will end up a watered down document which may not achieve
I think
much.
my colleagues have touched a lot on the Code of Conduct already. I mean, we expect hope that the first reading will be done by the end of this year. If not sooner, and then we will have a code of conduct in practice in another couple of years. So while South China Sea is one very important issue for us, and you might like to say it's a potential flashpoint, we also have other potential flashpoints like North Korea and so on, so forth. So that is what we take in the daily life of ASEAN. And issue of South China Sea with China will be discussed at the upcoming meetings. Code of conduct will be discussed. The whole point is that we can sit around the table and talk about these issues. When we're talking, maybe we will reduce the chance of escalation. A lot of people like to take the pessimistic option, of regional and multilateral cooperation, but it also needs optimism. And we believe that all these parties that are engaging with us, the dialogue partners, can bring a lot of good, to the region, to their peoples, and so on. For example, India and ASEAN, we are both growth areas, and it benefits India as much as it benefits us, to engage with each other. And the other, like the US, Chinese, and so on and so forth, Australasia, they also benefit from engaging together. The Indo-Pacific Outlook has 4 areas of cooperation that we hope to hear, including from India, about which areas they are interested in, which is, connectivity, sustainable development, maritime, and the what is E? There's economic cooperation. How can I forget that? So we're hoping that when we get together, we can see what areas of interest are there. And the thing that Ambassador Singh mentioned is that we have not excluded anyone or left or said that our way is the only way and Indian Ocean Rim Association is not relevant or so on. We have specifically included Indian Ocean Rim Association, which can take our talks right to the coast of Africa. We have included BIMSTEC, because we know that is important to this region. So I feel that with the difficult issues that are there, but we can still talk about the positive issues. Like Ambassador of Indonesia said, you never deal with relations among nations just in one plane. You know, there are many balls in the air, and the important thing is that you have to keep those balls in the air and not all on the ground.
Indeed, and as you rightly mentioned, lots of potential flashpoints, but I want to dwell on Chinese expansionism for a bit more. Do you believe that ASEAN as a group has the wherewithal, the strategic muscle to resist the push, or will it end up appealing to China's good sense?
So, in traditional power terms, the answer is no. Given Chinese power, economic and military, I don't think ASEAN is a match either way. But that is why they work these kind of things out, this consensual document, which changes the narrative and tries to give them ability to engage not only with China, but with all their other partners, including India, to try and perhaps change a non-power narrative which gives them a bigger and centralized role. Having said that, this code of conduct has been kind of going on forever. And I don't know when it's going to end. Perhaps it will end when the Chinese have achieved all their objectives in the South China Sea, and then they'll be ready to come. Having said that, let's look. Why is it that ASEAN only needs a code of conduct with China? And once they have it, then they'll open it to all the other partners and say, will you also sign on? Now, the point is, with India, they don't really need a code of conduct because we do strategic joint patrols with Indonesia, with Thailand. With 5 ASEAN countries, we have joint patrolling because there is mutual confidence that we are both committed to the same cause. I think ASEAN realizes that China is not committed to their cause, but they obviously realize they're not going to take them on. So they work out through the code of, and they show, I must say, compliment them, immense patience they show towards China. But China is an aggressive power. They are trying to use the South China Sea to change the geostrategic nature of this region, which is why I believe the Asia-Pacific has become the Indo-Pacific, because Asia-Pacific was not able to contain, and the conception has been changed. What is going to happen now is that the Quad will never become an institutionalized body, but it will remain a coordinating body where we will subscribe to the same principles that the outlook of ASEAN to the Indo-Pacific, and just try and contribute to keeping the sea lanes open and amity to prevail as far as possible. Not a single Quad country is going to take on China. But what happens if China takes on somebody? Our Vietnamese ambassador is already saying the Chinese are now exploring within their exclusive economic zone. What happens if this happens in more and more places? Are we going to turn away? Or are we going to keep pretending that we are waiting for the COC? So somewhere down the line, a more firm response has to come. I wish the Chinese would not come to that stage. I wish they would talk to more people. I wish they would adopt the ASEAN way.
Indeed. You mentioned the Quad. Ambassador, the US, China, Australia and India have all together and individually laid out their vision and their policy for the Indo-Pacific. And yet there is a feeling that there is a reluctance in ASEAN to engage in this conversation. Do you believe it is because member countries fear reprisal by China?
Before answering that question, I would like to supplement what has been said earlier by Ambassador Singh. I agree with him on most points. But there is one point I want also to make clear, that ASEAN gives importance to its relations with China. Because China is a strategic partner of ASEAN, in the same way as India is a strategic partner of ASEAN. And we want to have a friendly relations with ASEAN, and it is not our interest and our desire to put the whole ASEAN countries up front challenging China. That's number one. So I don't think there is a sort of a military match between the two. Number two, we are of the view that we will settle all the dispute through peaceful means and in accordance with international law. And therefore, I think that we renounce any act of threat or use of force. And I think that China understands that, and China will work with us. In terms of this code of conduct, we need to appreciate achievements so far over the past 1 year, and we need to compliment those who are at the negotiating table. Of course, since this code of conduct will be binding, substantial, and very effective, so it does take time for us to come to the final text. Of course, all of us would love to have an early signature and conclusion of that, and it become binding. Now coming to your questions about the Quad, our position you can see in the outlook of ASEAN on the Indo-Pacific is that this region, as perceived by ASEAN, is an open and transparent region, which is inclusive. So we welcome not only Quad, but any non-Quad countries into the region. So the question here is that since it's open and inclusive, we don't want to give a feeling or an impression that ASEAN want to have just some countries in that in order to make an Indo-Pacific. So, but nevertheless, we still welcome any contribution by any country within or without the region. And for the time being, the 4 countries, namely the USA, Japan, Australia, and India, are making positive contribution to the forming of the Indo-Pacific, and they are also try to help ASEAN to form the Indo-Pacific. What is interesting, and we need to stress that they agree that the role of centrality should be given to ASEAN, not to Quad, in the process of evolving this new security structure of Indo-Pacific in the region.
Right. The Quad had been a dormant group, but now it's becoming more active. And whatever they're doing, the region they're dealing with is also central to ASEAN. It affects their lives more than anyone else. How does and how should ASEAN respond to this geopolitical churn?
A key concept for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, is how to address the security dilemma. Security dilemma is when one country, in its effort to build its security, to push its security boundaries outwards, therefore to become more secure, inadvertently would affect the security of others, would create threats for others. And so this is the main challenge. So for ASEAN, bringing everybody on the table is a way of addressing the security challenge. Countries obviously would have their own ways on a bilateral basis, on their own national basis, but having the avenue of sitting together, discussing their security concerns, their security outlook, would, we hope, would also affect behavior of countries. So there's always that advantage of sitting together. The Quad, earlier I talked about ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality is central in the context of geography. ASEAN is central in the context that it creates all kinds of platform. It could be the East Asia Summit, it could be the ASEAN Regional Forum, it could be others. But also ASEAN is central in the context of its ability to bring everybody together and therefore have their own spin-off, if you like, spin-off meetings, spin-off engagements. So it came as no surprise that the Quad has also been using and benefiting the ASEAN meetings to have their own meetings. Almost 20 years ago, the China, Japan, Korea, they developed their own mechanism among them until today, also benefiting from the ASEAN context. So this centrality also brings benefit, a number of benefits, a number of understanding. And we hope is this centrality also can be able to address that security dilemma.
Right. How can ASEAN then ensure that the Indo-Pacific doesn't become a platform for power games, but for power games, but remains focused on economic cooperation and growth?
But you know, in the evolving world, there will always be rise and ebb and rise and fall of regional powers and global powers. Somebody had asked me before, why didn't ASEAN keep all the powers out of our region? Can you imagine how difficult that would be? because Ambassador Singh just said that, if you look at in terms of power, we can't do it, and so on. So so we engage, and it's a much better way to do that. And what we have here and what we're trying to evolve will also be relevant. I say it a lot in India, and Indians maybe don't want to accept it, but China will mature, and maybe one day will recede in relative terms, but India will rise. Okay, so the Indo-Pacific construct and the ASEAN centrality will also help us to deal with a rising India, and maybe after India, a rising somewhere else. So this is part of the daily life of ASEAN. So.
Ambassador Singh, how do you see India's position on the matter? Because India in the past has said that it is for something in ASEAN and not against somebody. That's easier said than done, though.
Very much. I think you rightly said easier said than done, because I think ASEAN are wonderful people, and they have done a great job to bring their own diversity together. And as Ambassador Indonesia said, they provided the opportunities through their mechanisms and centrality to actually allow the ASEAN plus 3 initially, Japan, China, Korea, and later the Quad. Basically, these are sideline efforts to what the ASEAN has done through the East Asia Summit. And I think India should always be grateful to Indonesia in particular. That is how India became a charter member of the East Asia Summit. Now, having said that, and let me say, absolutely no two thoughts about ASEAN centrality. Geographically, they are central. In our thoughts, they are central. In every way, they ought to be central. Now, 50 years down the line, when you are faced today with multiple threats to your way of thinking, and from a power which is is aggressive, what do we need? We need this ASEAN centrality to become more substantive. Supposing all ASEAN had been equally able to do what the Quad seeks out to do, there would have been no Quad. Quad comes together to fill in what we feel are certain power vacuums in keeping the sea lanes open, fulfilling the goals which ASEAN subscribes to. But ASEAN will not subscribe to Quad, because then it is seen as being a gang up against China. So in reality, ASEAN will not do that. But when you look at individual ASEAN countries, from my personal point of view, Indonesia and Vietnam are two countries who should certainly associate more with the Quad. I'm not saying be anti-China. Do more to police the sea lanes, keep them free of illegal migrants, keep them free of drug runners, keep them free from disaster relief. All these are common things that Quad sets out to do. But the problem with the Chinese is they see the Quad, they see Indo-Pacific, they see everything which is new as ganging up against them. The Chinese are not comfortable with the concept of Indo-Pacific. And therefore, for ASEAN to move into this space over the last 2 years, I think are baby steps in telling the Chinese, look, we know what you are up to. This is the way we are going to tackle you. So I think there is a real politic where the Chinese are changing the nature of not only the narrative, they're changing everything on the ground, setting up new ground in the seas. At the same time, ASEAN trying to create a narrative based on their own concept, but certainly India has no quarrel with the ASEAN way. India will stand by that. But we have to be clear, India's strategic view of China and the ASEAN strategic view of China are different. We see them as a clearly confrontationist power who will make no concession to us in trade, who will make no concession to us on the border. Whereas I don't think ASEAN has that straightforward a position vis-a-vis China. As they say, we are ready to discuss a code of conduct, we are ready to discuss. There are individual ASEAN countries like Vietnam, Philippines, who have faced the brunt of that. But I think by and by, they will just have to live with the 9-dash line becoming a reality. I think these difference of strategic perceptions will continue because these are our national interests. But that does not mean that we will ever impinge on ASEAN centrality. Never. From us, that remains a hard-written line of stone. But yes, we would like ASEAN to give us more substantive centrality or take responsibility for your centrality. That is more important.
Could I just add on this that, I mean, the beauty of ASEAN 10 is that we can take let's say, as Ambassador Singh said, Indonesia and Vietnam could play some more role in South China Sea patrol or whatever. And in this part of the region, Thailand could work with Indonesia, Singapore, India, and so on. So we have the ability through our diversity to play different roles. And country like Thailand, you didn't mention that we're in this camp or that camp, but we try to maintain balance, our strategic centrality within ASEAN and within all the powers that are around. That's how we have survived up to this point. But we also spend a lot of time to ensure that, the closer we are to China, we also do something that brings us closer to India to show that we are engaging, all the players. Recently a journalist said that ASEAN are smart people, but we are also nice. And this nice part makes us able to talk to all the parties here. And sometimes, people may come to Thailand to make their point known about South China Sea, or come to Indonesia, come to Vietnam. They feel that they can engage through us indirectly, or they can also engage directly. So we have the ear, or they have our ear, and we have the ear of all the players. And that is our value, even though we're small.
Right. Okay. But when we say nice, there's also is it also a way of saying that ASEAN is not going to sort of call a spade when it's needed?
We have different sorts of problems with different countries. Sometimes we have trade issues. Sometimes we have trade issues. Recently we have water issues with China because we share the Mekong River. But we raised the point with them, and then more water is coming, and Laos as well. So we found that being the size that we are, we use talk. But I also think that you can bring the pressure of the community to bear upon some players as well. If you were the largest in the room, at a certain point you still have to care about what everyone else thinks. So it's not, since we don't have the power option, we have the option of diplomacy and persuasion.
Very well said. You mentioned trade, sir. I want to ask about the US-China trade war, or the tariff dispute that's going on, and tends to have a domino effect. How can ASEAN ensure that it's insulated from this war?
Well, we believe that any trade war in the long run will not be beneficial to the interests of the stakeholders as well as the countries in the region. Perhaps in the short run, some country may benefit, but definitely, number one, that adds to the already growing tension and complexity of the situation of today. If you look at the map today, you see that, and sometimes you wonder yourself, how comes there are so many crises around you coming up at the same time? And now you have additional trade war between the two biggest economies. Of course, it is a worrying issue. Number two, in the long run, in a much longer run, will definitely you'll be affected, because, for instance, some countries at the moment shift their productions away from China to some other countries, and in that other countries which is neighboring to China will have a surplus trade with the US subsequently, because the surplus in trade that China has had with the USA will be shifted to the other countries in the region. So the tension of trade between the United States and that countries in the region will be increasing. We believe that strong trade war is not good at all. So we need to work closely together. We need to use various mechanisms. And Vietnam is the country with 200% open economy. We are the most populous open economy in the world. So we're supportive of a fair, open trade system in the world, which allowed every country to be able to export and to import. And no tariff, not only tariff, but non-technical tariff as well. We hope that all the countries understand that and work with that. Luckily, Vietnam is able to sign recently the free trade agreement with the European Union. In ASEAN, Vietnam is the second country after Singapore. And together with Singapore, Malaysia, and Brunei, we have been able to sign the CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Agreement, trade agreement. So we believe that free trade agreement like that one will help the trade of each and every country and the world trade, and that will help also economic growth.
You said some countries benefit in the short term, perhaps, and there is a fear that this competition over complementation is affecting ASEAN, is not letting ASEAN achieve the true potential of the bloc in the face of this challenge.
In the context of trade?
Yes.
There's, looking at the current challenges at the global level, there's even a more urgent need to conclude the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, that would bring the 10 ASEAN countries, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and India together in a single trading bloc. Now it's understood countries have many issues, many problems within this setup. Many countries have trade deficit with another. Many have trade deficits with China. That is understood. But the urgency of all 16 countries coming together and creating this bloc is obviously there. So we hope that this year it can be concluded. Now, being in New Delhi, I totally understand what the concerns are from Indian industry, from various business people I've been engaged with. That's understood. The job of negotiators is to sort out these issues. Now think medium to long term. Just looking at India, Indonesia alone, for example. Today, India is economy number 5, I think.
Yes.
Indonesia is number 16. In 30 years' time, when India, Indonesia celebrate 100 years of relationship, India will be number 2 largest. Indonesia will be number 4 largest. Now imagine the potentials that will be there. We should be thinking beyond commodities, beyond manufactured goods. We should be thinking in terms of joint development, design development of aircrafts, of sea crafts, of robotics, of artificial intelligence, electrical vehicles. We should be thinking in those terms. We should be thinking long term, and the rules for it can be set down within RCEP. Now bear in mind that the 16 countries is not a new concept, because back in 2005, and Ambassador Singh alluded earlier, when East Asia Summit was constituted, it was these 16 countries. So even our predecessors some 15 years ago have been thinking about this. Bringing these 16 countries together has its historical logic to it, and we need to be thinking medium to long term.
Indeed. What are your thoughts on this? How is this US-China trade war affecting intra-ASEAN dealings?
I don't know about intra-ASEAN, but it's affecting all of the ASEAN members. As you mentioned, some are benefiting in the short term. But when such big players, drivers of the global economy, are playing trade war games, and now you have Korea and Japan, it will affect all of us. Thailand's growth numbers have been revised twice already. Okay, so I support what my Indonesian colleague said, that when markets close, we need to open markets in other ways. So RCEP is one way, and I also support him that. But it's a difficult dilemma, Politicians have to satisfy the constituents today. But when you negotiate trade agreements, you should be negotiating for the future. you know, what India will look like in 10, 20 years' time, and so on and so forth. So that is what we have to help with help each other and help India to sell the RCEP agreement for its people. When we had the ASEAN Troika here recently, we understood better, you know, what India's issues are in terms of the political constituency and what the technical issues that India faces, including with China, so on. So this is how in ASEAN works. So at the table, we can, you know, help play as a team. We're not ganging up on China, but we know what we need to achieve a landing zone. And I believe that if India has the confidence and the Indian public can understand why RCEP is not a way to keep India down, or, you know, then other FTAs will follow, you know, BIMSTEC, and then India's asking for a revised ASEAN-India FTA, and so on. And that will help dampen, you know, the effect of it's foolish, really, you know, trade wars like that. We've been through it before, but sometimes people have political needs or to play the nationalism card. But in the end, you know, it's not much of nationalism if the people lose.
Indeed. India has also been at the receiving end of some of these outbursts and tariff-related actions from the US, and then there have been retaliatory tariffs. How does India see this trade war between America and China, and whether or not anyone should be looking at benefiting from it?
Well, you know, the thing is, I don't think there are any direct benefits, because if they went for the Chinese first, it's because they were the biggest trading partner. Then they came to us because we are next. I think Indonesia needs to watch out. They are going to be hit next, perhaps Thailand next. So the Americans are just going down the list. I don't think there are any more friends in the American trade ministry at all, commerce ministry. They're just going for all their partners saying buy more. So I think, as ambassadors of Indonesia said, RCEP is perhaps a good answer. But RCEP also is becoming like a code of conduct. It goes on and on and on. And I think I'm glad Ambassador Thailand said that now they understand India better, because I think initially we were being put in a corner saying we are the ones who have a problem with China and therefore we don't. Yes, there is a problem with China. China doesn't open up things and they want us to open everything. But I think unsaid, there is a problem with ASEAN. Because when we negotiated an FTA with ASEAN, we did the trade one first, because ASEAN said we will do the services later, which is our interest. It took 5 years to negotiate that, 3 more years to implement that, and India is still so dissatisfied with ASEAN on services and investment, which is our major interest. So you have a situation where our best friends in ASEAN were quite content to have an FTA on trade, but were not going to give ground on investment and services. So we are not going to pass an RCEP where our reasoning on trade and on services and investment is going to go a-begging from the beginning. I believe India has been too soft and defensive in its RCEP negotiations. Everybody comes to our door saying, come on guys, can you hurry up? I think we need to come up with a positive list of stuff we want from all the RCEP partners, New Zealand and Australia included, and say, you give us this and we will come to RCEP. After all, there is the cost for opening my market. They have mentioned the Indian industry and everything. There's a political cost. But that cost has to be met by giving me incentives to get into your countries in a big way, and that includes China.
What are the expectations of ASEAN from other regional players like Australia, like Japan, even the US, now that it's so active in the region?
I think that we can address that question from security perspective as well as from economic perspective. From security perspective, we believe that ASEAN has been able to bring to one table all the major power across the globe, even in the European countries, European Unions, and the United States. So that is one of the best achievements of ASEAN so far. Now ASEAN have to continue to engage those powers, outside region powers, into the region. And more importantly, when you are talking about the 4 regions, the Quad you mentioned, they are located in this part of the world. So it is more necessary and important for ASEAN to engage them more actively. And in addition to that, 4 countries, as you just mentioned, are, as we term it, Asian countries. and the 21st century is the century of Asia. So it is important for them to be engaged with us more. And of course, I think that we engage not only these 4 countries, we also engage with Russia and with China. And we are of the view that the bigger you are, the more responsible you should be vis-a-vis international relations. So that is from security-wise. From economic perspective, we believe that we have to work closely together in order to have a free trade. My colleague just mentioned about the necessity to have a free trade between India and other countries. On that matter, I also want to supplement that ASEAN are understanding the keen interest and concern expressed by India on various occasions, especially after the signing of the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement, which covers only goods and not much services. We understand that. We understand also for some countries the deficit with trade with India. We are trying to address that. But we believe that we are living in a society where everybody have to help each other since we are so connected. So the major countries also need to work closely together with us. On that occasion, I believe that India has a huge role to play because India is the country in the region, because India is now the 5th largest economy and going to be the 2nd largest economy. You will be able to double your GDP by 2022, $5 trillion US dollars, and you are following a policy of strategic autonomy. So there are many room for you to play here, not only in terms of security, but also in economic cooperation with other countries in the region.
Right. I'm taking closing comments, Ambassador, on the potential and the challenges and all that we've discussed.
Well, I'm very optimistic. I'd like to focus on India and ASEAN. When we talk about India-ASEAN, we have been talking about modern history. We've been talking about recent history. But actually, this is a relationship that goes back a long way. I welcome Ambassador Singh wearing a batik shirt. Our history even goes back. We have to be thinking about pre-colonialism history, how pattern of relationship took place then. Because I believe that the future would take that form, where relationship would grow in an organic, natural way. Now, it is, I think, India and ASEAN, we are a bit behind. A lot of catching up is needed. Therefore, what the initiatives of Indian government, especially by Prime Minister Modi ji, in the past 5 years of Act East policy, this is something that we welcome very much. On a bilateral basis, I'm very optimistic because my President Joko Widodo, has also recently been elected for another 5 years. So this will be a top leaders-driven relationship between India and ASEAN. And I'm also very upbeat about, I should say India-Indonesia, but I'm very upbeat about India-ASEAN as well. So we have a lot of work in front of us to do.
Indeed. Ambassador, closing comments.
Yes. I think that ASEAN, Indo-Pacific, vision on Indo-Pacific has been described as ASEAN's vista, what it sees, but we will still have to develop it, okay? Every day we have to think, how do we want to see the future? Okay, so this captures this moment in time. We grew with China. There have been positives, and there have also been growing pains. But for the future, the future is with India. And I'm sure that we will grow together, and there will be growing pains as well. But I hope that our relationship is a lasting one and even more positive. We know that deep down we can connect, at the heart and minds level. So I'm positive about the future with my colleagues, and it's more ASEAN India than ASEAN Thailand because Thailand is too small, so we only count as part of ASEAN.
Ambassador Singh, closing comments from you, and also India's relationship with ASEAN going forward.
I think the ASEAN has got three very good pillars of political, economic and socio-cultural. And I think the one we discussed the least today was the socio-cultural, because we were looking at the present. But indeed, if you hear them all and you look at the future, it is actually the socio-cultural pillar which holds us together. We have a long history of commonality, which is non-aggressive. It is inclusive. And these are the tenets that we talk about even today, whether it's in the Shangri-La dialogue, Prime Minister's speech, or in the inclusiveness. So this inclusiveness and the fact that ASEAN and India have very young populations. So the future belongs to us. Now it is up to us whether we grasp that future or we fritter it away on petty quarrels with others. Fortunately, India and ASEAN do not have quarrels. So I think ideally placed to reach out to the future and present a fixture, like he said, of bringing young people together, creating more jobs in new sectors, putting into, as he said, artificial intelligence, into making that cyber world is secure. There are many. The sky is the limit. And the sky over India and ASEAN is never going to be cloudy. Hand in hand, we will bring peace to this world.
Well, quite a thing to say on a rainy day in Delhi. And on that optimistic note, I'm going to thank you all for joining us on the third edition of WION World Order. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.